Thank you for this invitation. With this gathering, it feels a bit presumptuous to be the one here presenting concepts, but I'll do my best to give something. This book, which has just come out, called Positive Exclusion, isn't an edited book. It's co-authored by myself and Derek Collins at the back there and Phil Hirsch. And what it is, it's an attempt to build up sort of inductively out of our experiences across the whole Southeast Asian region, looking at the fact that land is being transacted, land is moving, people's access to land is changing very dramatically right across the region, and to ask ourselves what are the main processes through which that's taking place. And then at the part that I'm going to focus on today, like how is this happening? What are the powers involved? What does it actually take to exclude one person, or to claim an exclusive right to land, which means I exclude you, therefore I can use it, and to look at that, what we call the powers of exclusion. What are the powers through which that takes place? But seeing exclusion as a double-edged thing. Any land use, any productive land use, requires somebody to be excluded, right? If I can't hold on to it long enough to harvest my crop, I can't even be a farmer. So exclusion is a sort of endemic condition of land use. But the question is, what are the powers through which exclusionary rights are transferred, who gets to exclude whom, on what basis? That's really the concept that we're trying to explore in the book. So we came up with these 4 powers, and what I'm going to do is run through them and show how, using the lens that we devised to look at land transactions generally in Southeast Asia, how we might use this lens to think specifically about this phenomenon called the land grab. So I'm going to both give you an introduction to Southeast Asia, but more specifically to that topic. So these are the 4 powers that we came up with: legitimation, regulation, market, and force. And none of these are, of course, unique to land grabbing, but I'm going to argue that the way they have been articulated in relation to this phenomenon is a useful way of looking at what's going on here. So I'm going to start with legitimation, because this seems to me the most striking aspect of the whole land grab debate, has been the way that it really foregrounds the sense of what is right and proper in relation to land. That just seems to jump right out of this whole process. So the question then is, like, what is the language of legitimation? Who uses this language? And who contests or counters it, and in what terms? Familiar languages for legitimizing exclusion might be efficiency, productivity, development, conservation, security, modernization. These are all languages which are used to justify why I should have land and you shouldn't, or why your land should be transferred to me. If we look at the chain of legitimations involved in the land grab, we see that there is, in fact, particularly around 2007-2008, there was a particular series, and Olivier outlined quite a bit of it this morning, so I don't need to go into too much detail. But first of all, there was the idea that this price hike and instability created this crisis, this crushing need and anxiety around food supply, and that was what legitimated a new interest in land, and in fact the sense that it was right and proper to try to take control of land in order to be sure to have a food supply. This was linked then to this idea of food insufficiency, that somehow there's a growing population, there isn't enough food, productivity needs to be increased. This actually are unrelated things, but they got linked in a chain. Then this got hooked on as well to the idea that, well, poor people lack food, therefore producing more food is surely good for poverty. Again, these things don't actually add up, but in terms of the chain of legitimization, these were linked. And I see this coming up again in the press now. We have another price hike, and suddenly it's all about poor people are hungry. And I think these two things are not linked in the way you think they are. Right? It's not because there isn't enough food being produced that people are hungry. These two things are not the same. You also get a very strong link to the idea of land being underutilized, abandoned, has potential, needs to be used efficiently. And this, I'm finding increasingly, at least in this debate, is being used in the sense of a global good. And this, as Olivier, someone pointed out this morning, this is the classic colonial move, which basically says whoever is on the spot is underutilizing land, is wasting God's bounty, and therefore can legitimately be removed or displaced by a more efficient user in the name of the global good, in this case, productivity. So this kind of legitimating language is all over this particular set of current transactions, and they're laced through with this idea of Tina, there is no alternative. So we have the sense that, yes, there will be a price to be paid, and some smallholders might lose out, but in the context of this crisis mentality, which, under which many things are being legitimated, that idea that there's no other way of doing this, that you simply have to go to high-tech, large-scale production, is also part of it. If we then turn this around and say, what are the counters to this legitimation? Because obviously it doesn't stand uncontested. And arguably, just to call it a grab, right there in this counter discourse about land grabbing, is to basically reject all of the above legitimation and to say that a land grab, by definition, cannot be legitimate. It isn't legitimate. That's why we're calling it a grab. And further to say that the people who are on the spot are using it just fine, or with more support could use it better, but nevertheless to reject the idea that there is a crisis of that nature which requires a transaction of land to large-scale land users and investors. So there's a contestation at the level of legitimization, but that is not just words. So because this is in a discursive level, of course we shouldn't underestimate the work that does, because that provides the framework under which all kinds of other actions take place. Moving right along to regulation. How is regulation playing into this whole phenomenon? One of the first things to notice is how it links to the language of legitimation and enables it. If you read the World Bank's report on global land investment, the idea that this can be regulated or done in a proper and orderly way is one of the key legitimizing elements, right? If they were to acknowledge that it was in fact a grab, it couldn't be made legitimate through any kind of procedures. So regulation, the idea of proper procedure, is a huge part of the enabling framework here. We can do this properly. It's also quite remarkable that unlike the era in which private land titling and individualized titling was everywhere, we see now in the World Bank report a lot of recognition that one size doesn't fit all. We're absolutely open to recognizing differentiated populations, and the customary and the indigenous, and the community, and so on, and to title and license these appropriately. But the idea is that one could come up with a perfect regulatory framework in which everyone would be set in their place, and there would still be a suitable amount of land, then clearly unencumbered and made available for large-scale investment. So the setting up of a regulatory regime, which is in fact quite complex, but the idea that if you have everything zoned, pinned, licensed, and so on, you would know which investors could go where, is a huge part of how this particular set of transactions is being thought about, and why it's being thought about as potentially legitimate as well. If you actually look then at what happens, I would have under our type of regulation, we have not only licensing mechanisms like titling, forest zoning, and settlement schemes, all kinds of interventions which kind of try to settle who can be where on the land and doing what, come under our framework of regulation. But the first thing you notice empirically under any such framework is that although the objective is to create clarity and certainty and security, anyone who does any field research knows that what it actually produces is another whole layer of complexity and uncertainty and unsettlement. Because to the extent that the cookie cutter, this is the community, these are the community members, doesn't actually match people's histories of migration, their ethnic affiliations, their family links, their spatial mobility, and so on, what you've done is you've created what looks like a solid governable entity, but actually doesn't reflect most of the land relations which are going on. And so a tail end and sort of inadvertent product of regulation is in fact often to create new areas of grayness, compromise, maneuver, because the licensed, regulated, cookie cutter type of approach doesn't actually match how people use land and how people consider themselves to be entitled to it. So looking at the question of regulation then is a very useful way of thinking, how do land grabs take place? Are they taking, to what extent are they using a regulatory regime, and to what extent are they actually taking advantage of the insecurity and instability created by a regulatory regime? Because I think both of those things are usually working in tandem with each other. And so thinking about regulation then is another of the lenses that one can use to look at, like, how is it actually taking place? What is the role of regulation in it? Third, okay, market. Of course, ironically, it's market failure which is behind the whole land grab, in the sense that it's the idea that we used to buy our food on the open market, but now because some countries started trying to stop their exports, we get nervous about whether the market is an adequate mechanism for food for our people, and that's why we have to go and take up land and start farming ourselves, right? So a market failure, really, ironically, is kind of quite embedded in this whole thing. But it's also comes out in a language where it's a counter to say, well, we're not grabbing it, we bought it. We paid for the lease, this was a market transaction. So, oh, we paid for this, we purchased it, we paid the compensation. So, of course, a title is this idea of an individual title is a perfected instrument which makes land a completely free-floating commodity which anyone can buy and sell regardless of their history, who they are, their social situation, and so on. But what does it take to create such a free-floating commodity? Obviously, it takes a whole apparatus of law and force, often, to establish the status of land as such a commodity. So even when one may say there is a market, there is a land market, that kind of power, the power of money to buy something, is only the kind of lower layer of a whole set of legitimating and regulatory regimes which makes it possible for land to become a commodity of that kind. Nevertheless, again, one shouldn't underestimate what market does. If you are a smallholder or a poor person faced with a market price, I will give you this amount of money today to relinquish your rights, that's mightily persuasive. So market does enter in these transactions, but often in roundabout ways which are worth thinking about. Finally, force. Of course, the term grab flags force, and it's countered, by this idea that we didn't grab it, we paid for it, and so on. All forms of enclosure arguably are force if they're not directly violent. As Marx said, what is law but violence by other means? So basically, the layering of compulsion of being able to separate people from their land, even if it appears that the mechanism is money. When you put someone in a position that says, accept compensation today or nothing tomorrow and we kick you out anyway, you have a combination of market and force kind of working in the mechanism that actually excludes people from land. Last word, 1 minute, which is just to do with the actors. I think it's worth, in terms of each of these processes, it's worth thinking about the multiple actors that use these devices. So regulation, for example, is not only states. Local groups also use regulatory regimes. They often use markets. It was mentioned this morning that many kinds of land reform and land settlement deliberately try to prevent the emergence of a land market. Land reform beneficiaries may not sell their land, for example. People holding communal, indigenous tenures and so on may not sell their land, but the fact is that they do. So land markets can be pervasive and they can bubble up from below, and enclosure can also bubble up from below. It's not always something which comes from the outside or from above. So in terms of each of these forces, thinking about how it's used and which actors are using it is a good way of trying to understand the how of this particular set of transactions. Thank you.